The first time Dale Foster heard about Black Hollow Lake, he was standing outside the only bar in Coldwater, Maine, gripping a beer as the old locals spoke in hushed voices. He wasn't much for ghost stories, but when a fisherman named Red Carter leaned in and muttered, "People don't come back from there, son," Dale felt something cold crawl up his spine. Dale had been fishing all his life, traveling across the country looking for untouched, forgotten waters. He had spent his career as a professional angler, running a modest YouTube channel that focused on extreme, isolated fishing trips. But when he heard about Black Hollow, an unmarked lake deep in the wilderness, untouched by modern maps, a place the locals refused to acknowledge, he knew he had to go. It was too good to pass up. "You're making a mistake," Red warned, his pale blue eyes clouded with something Dale couldn't place. "That lake? It don't want you there." Dale chuckled, shaking his head. Superstitions. He'd heard them 1,000 times. Stories of cursed waters, of devil fish lurking in the depths, but he'd never seen anything he couldn't explain. So, despite the uneasy silence that followed him out of the bar that night, Dale packed his gear, loaded up his old Jeep Cherokee, and set out at dawn. The trip took him 30 miles into the thickest, blackest part of Coldwater's wilderness, where the roads turned to dirt and the trees grew taller than city buildings. His GPS gave up halfway in, leaving him with nothing but a tattered paper map he had bought from a gas station on the way. The deeper he drove, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his tires crunching gravel. By noon, Dale had reached the lake. Black Hollow was massive, larger than he expected, its surface like a pane of glass, untouched and eerily still. There was no dock, no cabins, just dark water surrounded by a forest that seemed to lean inward like it was watching. He stepped out, the air thick with an unnatural silence, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he didn't want to name. Dale shook off the feeling and got to work. He set up camp by the shoreline, took out his rods, and launched his small canoe into the water. As he paddled out, the world seemed to close in, the trees forming an unbroken wall behind him. The lake was deeper than it looked, its bottom invisible even in the afternoon sun. He cast his line, watching as the lure disappeared into the abyss. Nothing. He tried again, and then a pull. At first it was subtle, a light tug. Then, all at once, his rod bent violently, the line screaming as something below dragged it down with inhuman strength. His heart pounded. He had hooked something big, bigger than anything he'd ever caught before. Then the reel snapped. The force was so strong that it yanked the rod clean out of his hands, sending it spiraling into the dark water. Dale stared, breathing hard, his hands shaking. The lake had taken it, and in the silence that followed, something beneath the surface moved, a ripple spreading outward, impossibly wide. He wasn't alone. Dale sat frozen in his canoe, his breath slow and shallow. The ripple was still spreading, as if whatever was beneath the surface was waiting for him to react. He grabbed his spare rod, hands slick with sweat, and cast again, this time more cautiously. The lure sank into the deep, swallowed by the lake's darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. The water settled, eerily still again. Dale let out a shaky breath, forcing a chuckle. Maybe he had imagined it, the weight of the stories, the silence of the woods playing tricks on his mind. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely a breath on the wind. Voices, muted, distant, as if carried from beneath the water. His skin prickled. He turned his head, scanning the tree line, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Just the endless, silent forest. The voices grew louder, closer. "Help us." Dale's stomach lurched. The words were not coming from the shore. They were coming from the lake. He yanked his line up, desperate to leave, but the moment he tried to paddle back, his canoe lurched, as if something had grabbed hold of it from below. "Please, don't leave us." The whisper was right beside him now, as if someone unseen was crouched just beyond the canoe's edge. He refused to look down. He wouldn't. And then a hand broke the surface. Pale, bloated, waterlogged. The fingers curled over the edge of his canoe, dripping with black water, the nails cracked and broken. Another hand surfaced beside it. Dale screamed. He kicked off violently, rocking the canoe as the hands slid back into the depths, leaving only faint ripples. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he paddled frantically toward shore, every muscle in his body screaming to get away. When he reached land, he stumbled out, nearly collapsing onto the damp earth. His canoe drifted a few feet before stopping. The lake was calm again, almost mocking him. He grabbed his pack, his instincts screaming for him to run, but something caught his eye. Footprints. Not his, not fresh, but deep indentations in the mud leading from the water's edge into the trees. He crouched, his breath fogging in the cold air. The prints were barefoot, human, but wrong. The toes were elongated as if they had been underwater too long, the heel marks sunken unnaturally deep. He followed them with his eyes, his heart hammering. The footprints led into the woods, but they never came back out. A snapping branch broke the silence. Dale whipped his head up, staring into the tree line. Something stood between the trees, half hidden in shadow. Tall, watching, silent. Then it moved, not walking but gliding, like it wasn't touching the ground at all. Dale ran. Dale sprinted through the woods, his breath ragged, his legs burning with every frantic step. The thing in the trees was following him. He could hear the unnatural rustling, the way the branches didn't snap but simply shifted, parting for whatever moved between them. He risked to glance over his shoulder. Nothing, but he could feel it watching. Dale's foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling onto the cold, damp ground. Mud splattered his hands as he scrambled up, his ears straining for any sign of pursuit. Silence. Too much silence. That's when he realized the forest was wrong. The trees here were twisted, their trunks split and gnarled like something had grown inside them and burst outward. The air was thick with rot, a sickly sweet stench that clung to his throat. And then he saw them. The bodies, half buried in the undergrowth, their faces turned upward, mouths open in silent screams. Their skin was pale, bloated, as if they had drowned, but they were nowhere near the water. Their eyes were gone, the sockets black and hollow. Dale staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He had seen bodies before, accidents, drownings, but these had been taken. Help us. The whisper sent ice through his veins. Slowly his head turned. A woman stood just a few feet away, her skin gray-blue soaked, her dress torn and dripping. She stared at him with empty sockets, her mouth trembling. Please? It's still hungry. Dale bolted. He didn't stop running until he reached the shore. His canoe was gone. The lake, once still, was rippling again. Something shifted beneath the surface, rising, and then the trees behind him groaned. Dale spun around. It was here. A towering shape, wrongly jointed, its limbs moving too smoothly, its skin stretched too tight over its frame, its head tilted in an inhuman way. Its eyes weren't eyes. They were black pits, swirling like the lake itself, pulling him in. Come back to the water, Dale screamed. The thing lurched forward, and the lake opened up. The ground beneath Dale's feet collapsed. Water rushed up around him, swallowing his scream as he tumbled into the abyss. The world turned cold, suffocating, the lake pulling him down like hands were gripping his ankles. He kicked, thrashed, fought, but the water was thick, heavier than it should have been. It seeped into his clothes, pressing against his chest, trying to drag him deeper. Then he saw them. Bodies, suspended beneath him in the blackness, drifting in the water like forgotten relics. Their faces were distorted, flesh peeling, hollow sockets staring upward. One of them moved. Dale choked on a scream, his lungs burning as he flailed upward, desperate for the surface. His fingers brushed something, a hand. It grabbed him. A face loomed out of the dark. Red Carter. His mouth moved, bubbles spilling out. It doesn't let go. Dale tore free, his limbs screaming in protest. His head broke the surface, gasping, choking as he clawed for the shore. The forest was different now. The trees were dead, twisted, their bark blackened and rotting. The air reeked of decay, and the ground beneath him shifted, like something was breathing beneath it. Then he heard it. A voice, deep and guttural, not coming from the trees, not coming from the water, but from inside his own head. Stay. Dale turned, panting, shaking. The lake was watching him. The ripples weren't random. They were moving toward him, forming a shape beneath the surface, something massive, something waiting. And then, it rose. The water peeled back, revealing a gaping maw, lined with endless rows of jagged, bone-white teeth. Dale ran. He didn't stop. Not when the whispers begged him to stay, not when the trees swayed without wind, not even when the shadows reached for him. He didn't stop until he reached his jeep, threw himself inside, and slammed on the gas. The road stretched endlessly in front of him, the trees watching as he sped through the forest. But the silence wasn't natural anymore. It was expectant. Because Dale knew the truth now. Black Hollow doesn't let you leave. Not really. And when he checked the rearview mirror, the lake was still there, even though it should have been miles behind him. Even though he was no longer on the map, even though he could still hear the whispers in his head, "Come back to the water." The lake had no name, at least, none that anyone dared to say aloud. It was deep in the northern wilderness, where the trees stood like silent sentinels and the water was darker than a moonless night. The locals avoided it, whispering strange warnings about its cursed depths, but to Jake Wilcox and his two closest friends, Darren and Mike, it was the perfect fishing spot. Untouched, remote, and brimming with legend. The kind of place that called to men who didn't believe in ghosts, but had a taste for adventure. "Ain't nothing down there but fish," Mike had scoffed when the old gas station clerk warned them. "And a hell of a lot of them, if what they say is true." Jake had smiled at that. They weren't just here for the fish. They were here for the thrill, the idea of catching something massive in a place where few had ever cast a line. The three men packed their gear into their small aluminum boat and shoved off from the cracked wooden dock. The water lapped against the hull, eerily calm, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. For the first few hours, it was perfect. The fish were biting, the air was crisp, and the silence was a welcome escape from the noise of civilization. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The trees cast long, claw-like shadows over the water, and the once soothing sound of the waves began to feel off, like a voice just at the edge of hearing. "Did you hear that?" Darren muttered, pausing mid-cast. Jake shook his head, but Mike frowned. "Like a whisper," he said, his voice quieter than before. They shrugged it off, just the wind through the trees. But the unease settled in like the growing darkness around them. They decided to fish a little longer, waiting for the real prize. The legendary deep-water fish rumored to lurk below. Mike rigged up a heavy line and dropped his bait, watching it sink into the blackness. For a while, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, unnatural tug. "Got something," Mike grunted, gripping his rod as it bent hard, the reel screeching against the strain. Whatever was on the other end was huge. His muscles strained, his breath came in short bursts. Jake and Darren reached for their flashlights, aiming them at the water, but it was too dark to see. Then the water moved. A slow, unnatural ripple spread across the surface, too wide, too deliberate. The air stank suddenly, a foul, rotting stench that burned their nostrils. Mike's line snapped, sending him sprawling backward into the boat. Silence. And then, from the inky blackness of the lake, something surfaced. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything they had ever seen. It was watching them. The boat rocked violently as something moved beneath them, something massive. The water, so unnervingly dark before, now seemed like an endless abyss, a doorway to something ancient. The air was thick with rot, the putrid scent of something long dead and festering. What the hell was that? Darren whispered, his voice barely audible over the eerie silence that followed. Mike, still sprawled in the boat, shook violently. His hands fumbled at his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. His face had gone pale, almost gray. Jake crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder. "Mike, hey, you good?" Mike's eyes darted wildly, like he was seeing something they weren't. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Then, just as suddenly as the fit had started, it stopped. He let out a sharp breath and sat up, wiping sweat from his brow. I saw it," he finally whispered. "Saw what?" Darren asked. "The thing in the water," Mike swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It wasn't a fish, it had eyes. Too many. And they were looking at me." Jake and Darren exchanged uneasy glances. They wanted to brush it off as exhaustion, a trick of the dark water, but the way Mike shivered, the sheer terror in his eyes, it was unsettling. "We should leave," Jake said. "Hell yeah, we should," Darren agreed, already reaching for the motor. But then, the boat lurched, not from a wave, not from the wind. Something underneath them had pushed it. And then the whispering returned. It was subtle at first, like the wind weaving through the trees, but it grew, layered, rhythmic, unnatural. Not one voice, but many, whispering in a language they couldn't understand. It slithered through their ears, wrapping around their thoughts, making their skin crawl. Mike clapped his hands over his ears. "Shut up! Shut up!" he shouted. Jake grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. "Mike, there's nothing there." "Yes, there is!" Mike's scream was raw, primal. Then the whispering stopped. Silence. Just the lapping of the water against the boat, the rhythmic creak of the hull, nothing else. For a moment, they sat frozen, barely breathing. And then, a splash. They all spun around, shining their flashlights at the water. Nothing. Just ripples, like something had just slipped beneath the surface. "Screw this, we're leaving," Darren growled, yanking the cord on the motor. Nothing. He tried again. The motor refused to start. "Oh, come on." Darren slammed his fist on it. Jake pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal, not even a flicker of a bar. They weren't just stuck. They were trapped, and the lake was waiting. The motor refused to start. No matter how many times Darren yanked the cord, no matter how much Jake twisted the choke or banged on the casing, it just wouldn't turn over. The lake, dead still, seemed to watch them. No wind, no ripples, nothing. Even the distant sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustle of branches, had vanished. Mike sat hunched over in the boat, his hands still pressed to his ears, rocking back and forth. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. "It's still here," he muttered. "Mike, shut up," Darren hissed, yanking the cord again. Nothing. Damn piece of... Then the boat moved. Not from their frantic efforts, but from something else, something beneath them. It was subtle at first, just a slow, deliberate drift. Then the water below gurgled, a bubbling, sucking sound. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, shining his flashlight at the water. The surface boiled, small bubbles rising up, popping like wet lips whispering against the night. "That's not normal," Darren whispered. Then, a shape, not a fish, not a log, something long and pale, moving just below the surface. A shape with too many limbs. Mike suddenly jerked upright. His pupils, so dilated they had nearly swallowed his irises, flicked from side to side. "It's not the lake," he whispered. "What?" Jake asked. Mike turned his head so slowly it was almost mechanical. His expression was vacant, hollow. "It's not the lake." Then, the voices returned. Louder this time. Urgent, hissing, not just whispers, but "Please, help us, let us in, it hurts." Jake clutched his head as the voices dug into his brain. "Shut up, shut the hell up," Darren shouted, covering his ears. Then, the water exploded. Something breached, something huge. Jake barely had time to register the unnatural shape before the boat rocked violently. Mike screamed as he was ripped backward. Jake lunged for him, his fingers grazing the collar of Mike's jacket, but he was gone. Dragged beneath the surface. The lake swallowed him without a single ripple. Silence. Jake and Darren sat, frozen, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's gone," Darren whispered, voice trembling. Jake stared at the black water where Mike had been just seconds ago. No bubbles, no sign of a struggle, like the lake had simply claimed him. And then something rose, not from the water, from inside the boat. Darren's breath hitched. A wet, sucking sound filled the air. Slowly, so slowly, they turned. And there, in the corner of the boat, something wrong was crawling up from the shadows. A shape, something that wore Mike's skin. "Mike?" Jake's voice was barely more than a whisper. He knew it wasn't him, couldn't be him. But his mind refused to fully accept what was crouched in the boat with them. The figure looked like Mike. Same soaked flannel shirt, same jeans, same boots, dripping lake water onto the aluminum floor. But his eyes were wrong. Too black, too deep. As if the sockets led into something endless, and his skin, pale, stretched too tight, glistening with something unnatural. Like a second layer had been pulled over something else. "Mike?" Darren's voice wavered. The thing tilted its head, a grotesque, unnatural movement, like something practicing human gestures but not quite getting it right. Then it smiled. Its lips peeled back, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. Darren lunged for the paddle. "Get the hell out of here," he roared, swinging. The thing that wasn't Mike moved faster than anything that size should. It didn't dodge. It didn't flinch. It just watched. Jake grabbed the other oar and slammed it into the thing's chest. It didn't react, just kept smiling. Then it spoke. "It's hungry." The voice was wrong. It wasn't Mike's anymore. It was layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. Jake didn't think. He just moved. He grabbed Darren's arm, yanked him toward the side of the boat. "Jump!" Darren hesitated for half a second too long. The thing lunged, Its arms stretched, elongating unnaturally, fingers twisting into claws. It grabbed Darren by the throat. Jake dove into the water. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, but he kicked, fought his way to the surface, gasping for air. The boat rocked violently. Darren was screaming. Jake turned just in time to see Darren being pulled down. His hands clawed at the boat's edge, his fingers dragging, scraping against the metal, but it wasn't enough. He was gone. The water swallowed him. Jake treaded water, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was alone. The boat was empty, except it wasn't. The thing that had once been Mike crouched at the edge watching him were still hungry. Then, it reached for him. Jake didn't wait. He turned, arms thrashing, kicking with everything he had. He swam. The whispers followed him. Come back. It's not done. We need more. Somehow, he made it to shore. He scrambled onto the rocks, panting, coughing up lake water. Behind him, the lake was silent again. The boat drifted in the blackness, empty. Jake ran. They never found Mike or Darren. Jake told the authorities what had happened, but they dismissed it as an accident. You boys went out there at night, probably drank too much. Maybe they fell in, maybe they got tangled in some debris. But Jake knew the truth. It wasn't the lake, it was what lived beneath it. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, when the air feels too still, he swears he can still hear them calling his name. The lake was a stretch of ink under the moonlight, its surface as smooth as glass. Luke Palmer dipped his oars into the water, the slow creak of the wooden boat echoing into the void. The lake had a name, but no one used it. Locals just called it the Black Water, a place they warned tourists to stay away from. Something about disappearances, bad omens, things that didn't belong in nature. But Luke didn't believe in small-town superstitions. He was here for one thing: the fish. This lake was rumored to have catfish the size of dogs, monstrous creatures lurking deep beneath the surface, feeding on whatever sank to the bottom. That's all that mattered to Luke. He had spent the last year traveling across the country, fishing at every hidden lake he could find. The thrill of the unknown, the stories, the challenge, that was his high. He lived for this. He cast his line, watching the silver lure disappear into the blackness. A cold wind swept across the water, rustling the reeds along the shore. He shivered. The air smelled strange, like something rotting beneath the surface. Probably a deer carcass that had fallen in. It wouldn't be the first time. A sharp tug nearly yanked the rod from his hands. His pulse spiked. That was fast. Too fast. He braced himself, gripping the rod with both hands as it bent nearly in half. Whatever was down there was enormous. He dug his heels into the boat, reeling hard. Then the water burst open. Luke barely had time to react before something huge, long, sinuous, and pale as a corpse, slammed against the side of the boat. The impact nearly threw him overboard. He gasped, scrambling to grab onto something, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. He caught a glimpse of slick, slimy flesh, a glistening mass that coiled and vanished back into the depths. Silence. The boat rocked gently. Luke's heart hammered against his ribs. The water settled, but the darkness beneath the surface felt alive, watching, waiting. Then from the depths, a whisper rose up, curling around him like smoke. Leave now. Luke froze, his breath caught in his throat. He had heard that, a voice, low, rasping, unnatural, whispering up from the depths of the lake. He turned sharply, scanning the water, but there was nothing. Just the gentle lapping of waves against the side of the boat. The silence felt heavier now, like something was watching. He forced himself to laugh. All right, Luke, you're losing it, he muttered, shaking his head. Maybe it was just the wind. Yeah, that had to be it. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't. There was something in this lake, something that shouldn't be here. His hands trembled as he reeled in his line. It came back frayed, the steel leader shredded like paper. His stomach clenched. He had fished in lakes with alligators, sharks, even giant sturgeon, but nothing had ever done this to his gear. The boat lurched, nearly tipping him over. Luke barely had time to react before something beneath him dragged the boat forward. His heart pounded as the water churned violently, as though something massive was pulling him toward the center of the lake. He grabbed an oar and paddled furiously, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The water settled. The boat drifted. But the silence was worse. Luke sat there, gripping the oar with white-knuckled hands. Every instinct screamed at him to leave now, to row back to shore and never return. But another part of him, the stubborn, thrill-seeking part, refused. He had come here for a challenge, and if something this big was lurking beneath the water, he needed to see it. He reached for his tackle box, grabbing a thicker, reinforced line, and cast again. The lure vanished beneath the surface. The minutes stretched. Nothing. Then the line snapped tight. Luke barely had time to react before something yanked him forward. He slammed against the edge of the boat, gripping the rod with both hands as his whole body lurched toward the water. His muscles burned as he tried to keep control. Whatever was on the other end of that line was stronger than anything he had ever fought before. The water began to glow. A pale, sickly green light pulsed from the depths, illuminating the rippling surface. Luke's breath hitched. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. The light grew brighter, shifting, taking shape. And then, for the first time, he saw it. A face, not a fish, not a man. Something in between. Hollow, black eyes stared up at him, empty and endless. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing a row of jagged, needle-like teeth. It was still hooked on his line. Luke let go. The moment his fingers released the rod, the thing let out a deep, inhuman wail that vibrated through the water. The lake erupted as dozens of pale hands reached up from the depths, clawing at the boat, trying to pull him under. He scrambled backward, grabbed an oar, and swung wildly, smashing at the writhing hands. His pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't think, he just moved. Survival took over. The hands recoiled, slipping back beneath the water. The lake went still again. The green glow flickered, then vanished completely, leaving him in utter darkness. Luke sat there gasping, his body drenched in sweat. The boat drifted. The night was silent. But the last thing he heard, just before the wind picked up again, was a whisper curling around him like a dying breath. "Next time, you won't escape." Luke's hands wouldn't stop shaking. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sat frozen in the drifting boat, staring at the still, black water. The whispers were gone, the glow had vanished, but the horror of what he'd just seen clung to him like a second skin. His mind screamed for him to leave. Row back, run, never look back, but his body wouldn't move. The lake had almost taken him, almost pulled him under. But what disturbed him most was that he knew, deep down, this wasn't over. It was waiting for him. A sound echoed in the distance, a soft, rhythmic sloshing. Another boat? Luke snapped his head up, eyes scanning the water. His gut twisted. There, about 20 yards away, another boat floated in the darkness. At first he thought it was just an empty drift boat, maybe lost and abandoned, but then he saw it. A man was sitting inside. Luke's throat went dry. "Hey, you okay over there?" His voice felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The man didn't move. He sat with his back straight, his head tilted downward as if staring at something in his lap. The boat rocked gently beneath him, too still, like it was frozen in place. Luke squinted, trying to make out the details in the dim light. The man's skin was gray, almost blending into the night. His hands, resting on his knees, were bone-thin and gnarled. Something about him felt wrong. Luke's stomach turned. "Hey man, are you hurt?" He picked up his oar and slowly paddled closer, the water unnaturally silent beneath him. Then the man twitched, a violent, jerking motion, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Luke froze, every instinct screaming at him to stop moving. The man's head snapped up. Luke saw his face and wished he hadn't. The man had no eyes, just deep, gaping holes where they should have been. His mouth was stretched too wide, filled with rotting, jagged teeth. Water poured from his throat, spilling onto his lap. His clothes soaked through as if he had been underwater for hours, days, years. Then he smiled. Luke jerked backwards, slamming his oar into the water. "Jesus Christ!" The thing in the boat opened its mouth, and from the cavernous abyss inside, a voice that wasn't its own whispered, "You should not be here." The boat lurched forward, moving toward Luke without oars. The water rippled unnaturally around it, dragging it closer, closer, closer. Luke didn't think. He rowed, hard. His muscles burned, his breath came in desperate gasps, but the thing was gaining on him. Then suddenly, his boat hit something solid. He almost fell forward, the impact jarring his teeth. He turned, panicked, expecting to see rocks, a sandbar, anything. But it was a dock. The dock. Luke's chest heaved. He had made it back to shore. But how? He didn't question it. He scrambled out of the boat, his legs nearly collapsing beneath him. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He just ran. As he reached the edge of the forest, the last thing he heard from the lake was a slow, wet laugh. And then, a voice. "You can't run forever, Luke." Luke didn't stop running until his lungs burned and his legs felt like they would give out. His boots crunched against the damp forest floor as he reached his truck, parked just beyond the tree line. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for his keys. "Get in. Get out. Don't look back." The whisper still echoed in his head. "You can't run forever, Luke." He finally yanked the door open, throwing himself inside. With a trembling hand, he turned the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. No, come on, damn it!" Luke turned the key again. Nothing. His breath hitched. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. The lake was moving, not the waves, the entire lake. The surface rippled unnaturally, like something beneath it was shifting, awakening. A deep, rhythmic thud pulsed from the water, shaking the trees, rattling the truck, like a heartbeat. Luke's stomach twisted. He had to get out of here, now. He grabbed his phone, no signal. He hit the horn, a hollow, dead silence. Every sound was being swallowed by the lake. Then a handprint appeared on the truck window. Not from the outside, from the inside. Luke's breath caught in his throat. The print was dripping wet, fingers too long, the skin a pale, bloated gray. Another print appeared, then another, and another. He couldn't breathe. The truck shook violently, the doors rattling as unseen hands slammed against the glass. Then from the back seat, a whisper. "Let us in, Luke," Luke screamed. He threw himself out of the truck, stumbling backward. The forest was deathly silent. He turned toward the lake. The water had stilled again. The unnatural movement was gone. But something was standing on the dock. Luke's pulse pounded. It was the man from the boat, the drowned thing. It stood there, motionless, its head tilted slightly, watching him. And then, it smiled again. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed to the water. Luke understood. It wanted him to come back. To finish what he started, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath him. The air grew thick, heavy, the pressure of something vast and ancient rising from the depths. Luke made a choice. He turned and ran. This time he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He left his truck, his gear, everything. He sprinted through the woods, heart hammering, lungs screaming. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, flagged down a passing car, and left the Blackwater behind. For good. Luke never went back. He never spoke of that night, never fished alone again. But sometimes in his dreams he still hears the whispers, still sees the face, grinning from the darkness, waiting for him. And when he wakes, drenched in cold sweat, his heart hammering in his chest, there's always a wet handprint on his bedroom window.